All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to call to order the joint meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission with the City Council Ordinance Committee. Welcome to everybody who's here, both in person and on the screen. This is going to be an
Recording in progress.
Okay. Now we're recording. Good. This is going to be interesting to try and coordinate it between the people here and on the screen who are remote, but I'm sure it will all work out. So first item on our agenda is the agenda. Are there any changes to it?
We do not have any changes to the agenda.
Okay. Seeing no changes, we have our agenda as presented. Item 2 is the public forum. This is an opportunity for members of the public who'd like to speak to us on pretty much any item they would like to, whether it's on the agenda or not. And Charles, do we have anybody who'd like to speak?
We do. We've got Sharon Busher. All right, Sharon, you should be all set.
Yes, thank you, Charles. Hi, good evening to everybody. I want to speak on the presentation that you're going to get on the proposed amendments to inclusionary zoning. And it's always a catch-22 when you speak before the presentation, because I have been known to maybe misinterpret some of the information that's presented, and there's clarity during the presentation and discussion. But I did want to speak in support for some of the proposed amendments. The one that allows for more than just the market rate number of bedrooms. Sometimes there are 2 or 3 bedrooms for multi-generational families, and that's in the amendment that's 9.1.14A. And I felt that that amendment exception worked well to address that group of people that live in our community or want to come to our community and find housing. Yet when I looked at the amendment that's 9.1.11.b, I felt like that negated A. And so it felt like then, if indeed you meet all the criteria and your gross whatever floor area is greater than 15%, then you don't have to meet that criteria. And it seemed that that you could make any number of size units. So I didn't feel comfortable about how those two worked together and stood alone. So I just wanted to speak to that, especially when it's in form-based code where it's by right, where there's no conversation with anybody. So I wasn't quite sure if a developer, I know this is predominantly being driven by City Place, but it would apply to anybody. And if a developer, I mean, you're depending on the goodwill, not goodwill, but the integrity, I guess, of the developer to make sure that they really are looking at what the needs are and addressing those. And I know some would say, well, that's driven by the banks and the financing. Someone's not going to build what isn't going to be rented or sold or whatever. And yet I'm not comforted by that, because I think with such a need for housing, units will be purchased or rented, but that doesn't necessarily meet the fact that we are actually meeting the needs of the community. I don't feel that guarantees that. And so I would like I'm hoping that as you look at this and hear the presentation, you take into consideration what I am saying, and make sure that you are feeling that these two proposed amendments do work alone, separately, and really don't counteract each other. The other thing I wanted to say was that I am concerned about our marketplace and the number of bedrooms and the fact that City Place is going to be mainly residential. And so I am, Andy, going to say one thing about your second item, which you may or may not get to, which is the in Ward 5 on Pine Street, that mixed use. I continue to be concerned about the fact that my worry is when you look at our goal or our mission, we are definitely addressing the housing crisis. I can't fault anybody on that, but I am concerned that we are not looking out for our own personal well-being as a community, because I think we are not guaranteeing a healthy mix of commercial, retail, and residential. And I'm fearful that when all is said and done, we will become the bedroom town for South Burlington and Williston. And so I continue to be very pessimistic about some of the new proposed development and the mix that is moving forward. So thank you so much for your time.
No, we do not.
Okay, that looks like it is it for our public forum. Again, Sharon, thank you. We'll move on to item 3, which is the proposed CDO amendment ZA-23-02, inclusionary zoning. But before we get to the substance of this, as I said at the beginning, this is a joint meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission and the City Council Ordinance Committee. And I probably should have done this at the beginning, but I think it would be worth all of us introducing ourselves to each other, because I don't know if everyone on the Ordinance Committee knows the Planning Commissioners, or the Planning Commissioner knows everyone on the Ordinance Committee. So I will start. I'm Andy Montrol, Chair of the Planning Commission.
I'm Bruce Baker, Vice Chair of the Planning Commission.
Hi, Michael Gahn, member of the Planning Commission.
I'm Maya Brandt, East District City Councilor.
Brian, do you want to say hello?
Sure. Brian Pine, Director of the Community and Economic Development Office. Thank you, Andy.
Everyone knows you guys, but if you want to introduce yourselves while.
Sure. Charles Dillard, Office of City Planning.
I'm Megan Tuttle. I'm the director for the Office of City Planning. And just because it's far away, this is Sarah Morgan. She's also a planner in our office. We'll go to the folks online. I don't know if we want to continue. Ben, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Megan. Ben Travers, City Councilor from Ward 5 and Chair of the Ordinance Committee. Thank you for organizing this and for hosting us this evening.
Hey, Ben.
Maybe I could pass it to Emily, maybe?
Hi, I'm Emily Lee, and I'm a member of the Planning Commission.
Eves, was that your dog?
Yes, that was my dog. She's a panelist. Her name is Molly. My name is Eves Bradley. I'm a member of the Planning Commission.
Alex Friend, Planning Commissioner.
Hi, I'm Julia Randall. I'm a member of the Planning Commission.
Wait, did we get it? I didn't see you, Kim. Go ahead.
Oh, Kim Sturdivant, acting city attorney, and staff both staff the ordinance committee, but also worked with the planning commission.
Great. Well, again, greetings to everybody who's here, and glad everyone can make it for our joint meeting. So on this item, who's going to kick it off for us?
All right, so Charles is going to give us a presentation about the substance of the proposed amendment that is in the packet for tonight's meeting. I'll just say a few very brief opening kind of points. This amendment is coming to us, as the Planning Commission heard at their meeting last week, at the request of the city, a joint kind of request by our office along with CEDO and the mayor's office to consider a few of these kind of targeted tweaks to our current inclusionary zoning standards. I won't go into a great amount of detail because I think a lot of you know this from other forums, but the mayor shared with the Planning Commission last week that one of the kind of driving factors for the timeliness of this question, it has to do with City Place. I think the mayor had shared that while progress has certainly been made on moving forward with City Place, there are still some uncertainties that remain in terms of the actual mix of residential units that would ultimately become part of that project. And the success of that project depend on a little bit of flexibility in terms of how our inclusionary zoning standards work with regard to bedroom mix and unit size, which is why we're kind of narrowly focusing on these issues. But as we talked about at the last meeting as well, these issues were among many that were also considered and updated as part of a collaborative effort to comprehensively look at our inclusionary zoning ordinance back in 2018-2019 time period. Ultimately, we did make some tweaks to the part of the ordinance that deals with bedroom size, and that was an issue that garnered debate all the way up until the last minute when the ordinance changes were adopted. Really kind of grappling with what was the best way to deal with the sort of parity between inclusionary and market rate units. And while we had to a lesser degree, we had a little bit of discussion, but to a much lesser degree about the kind of bedroom mix as well. But ultimately, it's not surprising that these issues are coming up again, because I think that we're seeing in the types of projects that are incorporating large numbers of inclusionary units and the changing dynamics of our housing market, we are seeing at once the possibility that inclusionary units could be both larger and smaller than market rate units, depending on the specific circumstances of an individual project. So really we're trying to focus on just these two pieces in order to grapple with those issues. So Charles is going to walk through the proposal in terms of what the three changes are that we're recommending and some discussion about the rationale for those. And I think feel free to jump in with questions within the presentation for each of these issues.
Thanks, Megan. So yes, I will provide more detail to the summary that Megan just gave. So there's sort of two overarching changes proposed here. The bedroom mix, there's two bedroom mix and then one that deals with the unit size. So high-level summary here is that the first would allow projects where the inclusionary zoning units include more bedrooms than is currently required by the standard today, which essentially requires the same ratio of bedroom mix in the inclusionary component of a project as is in the market rate component. The issue here, I will get into in just a moment. Let me first just talk about these other two. So also related to bedroom mix, Megan just mentioned the City Place project, but there are others that we can contemplate where the market rate component's bedroom mix does not sort of translate to the demand of affordable housing in the city and the community. And we'll get into more detail and provide some examples of how that might be. And the third is the gross floor area or unit size rather, and how the ordinance today regulates unit sizes and requires that inclusionary units be no less than 90% of the floor area of market rate units. And again, we can relate this to City Place, but also other developments where there's not a sort of direct match in the demand for market rate units and affordable units. So the first issue with regard to larger inclusionary zoning units, so it's typical market rate development that we're seeing in Burlington and many communities is consisting of studios, one-bedroom units, But we can imagine that an affordable housing developer might have a waiting list for 2-bedroom units, 3-bedroom units, and in a development today where 90% of units are studios and 1-bedrooms, there's simply no pathway for the affordable housing to deliver those in-demand sort of larger units. And so this proposal would allow the inclusionary units in a project to include units with a greater number of bedrooms than the market rate unit component of the project. There is a shortage of family size units, I would say, in all types of development, and I think it's important that the ordinance establishes a framework for family-sized affordable units. We have a question from Bruce.
Charles, I didn't see anything addressing, when you have 1-bedroom units and market rate versus inclusionary, the gap is fairly narrow as far as the rent is concerned, but when you get to a 4-bedroom, it progressively by bedroom count goes up. Are you addressing that at all in this? Because what I'm saying is we can wish for us by fiat to do something, but it may not get done in the marketplace. In fact, that's why we're here, because City Place is saying the marketplace for us dictates more bedrooms, and the marketplace for inclusionary nonprofit developers dictates something else.
That's
In fact,
right.
I'd say they probably never will match up.
That's right. I think we've heard from affordable housing developers that there's simply no wait list for 4-bedroom affordable units. And if City Place is proposing 4-bedroom market rate units, that obviously leads to an issue in the ordinance today.
This first issue is really, though, intended to allow greater flexibility. I think one unintended consequence of the way that the ordinance has been written in the past is that our presumption was always that people would want to build smaller inclusionary units than market rate units. But this allows the flexibility if a project is primarily studios and 1-bedrooms, that some of those inclusionary could be 2-bedrooms, for example, where it would not have been allowed before.
If I could just say one more thing, I think, and this is beyond the scope of this, the solution for us may be in another part of the ordinance at another time, which is FAR instead of dwelling units per acre, which tends to incentivize the marketplace to produce, especially in the college markets, larger units, even though they may not want to build the larger units. It's an operational headache to manage more tenants in one unit and I'm just saying that there may be a fix outside of this, but we should put it on our to-do list.
I was just going to add that the experience over actually not just recent years, but really over quite a few years from affordable housing developers is that there's the cost of development combined with the access to tax credit equity and other forms of essentially subsidy that make these projects work, that sadly that the larger units don't usually pencil out for them, and so they can take on a few of them and hope that they can fill them, but their waiting list and their demand continues to be for the 1- and 2-bedroom units. As much as we all would like to see more family-sized units, it doesn't necessarily it doesn't directly correlate to, or I'd say the organizations that are providing most of the affordable housing are seeing less and less demand. Household size has continued to shrink. That's not always true, but as a society, that's what we've seen in a significant way. So it's somewhat recognizing that reality as well.
And then the last thing I'll just add related to this point, and then you do have a couple online comments, Andy, is that I just wanted to acknowledge the kind of question or point that Sharon Busher raised in public forum about this feeling like it conflicts with what's in the next recommendation. And I think to some degree that may be true, that this could be a moot point if we're allowing for greater flexibility of the bedroom mix between market rate and inclusionary units. But we felt it was important to make this change explicit, that it would enable this.
Thanks. So I can't see the people who are remote. So if anyone wants to speak during this discussion, and I understand there might be a couple people, just speak out, and we'll have to figure out how to make sure everyone takes their turn, but just speak out because I can't see.
Emily, you
I had
first.
a comment. Thank you, Alex. I guess I don't follow why what problem this is solving. Because I understand it gives more flexibility, but I don't understand why a developer who is required to build a certain amount of units would ever choose to build a larger unit. And with more bedrooms, if their requirement is to build smaller units with smaller bedrooms, with fewer bedrooms, because that would be less costly. So why would a developer want the flexibility to build bigger units and incur more cost? Am I missing something?
And I think Brian and Bruce may be able to elaborate. You know, I think at a time when a market rate project is coming, let's say the affordable developer has a particular need or demand, the wait list is growing for, let's say, 2-bedroom units, and they really want to bring those online. I think that could be a scenario where this amendment would be helpful, and I don't know if...
A market rate developer would look at what they can garner for revenue per square foot versus the cost to produce that square footage. And if you look at a student rental, for example, with 4 bedrooms and 1 bathroom and 1 kitchen, that's going to be cheaper per square foot to produce, and it's going to bear more rents per square foot.
So am I understanding that these larger units would, allowing the larger units is more profitable to a developer than a smaller unit because they garner more per square foot in rental income?
I would say it could be. Probably one exception is 1-bedroom luxury units per square foot. They've gotten smaller, and the developer, you've seen them get on the market rate side get much smaller, but rents have gone farther up, and that's because of construction costs, and rents per square foot have gone up because of demand.
Okay, I guess I'd be interested to see those, like any data on those numbers about what a inclusionary unit goes for versus a regular unit. I guess my concern is that the larger inclusionary zoning units would be, you know, filled with like maybe students who don't make a lot of money and qualify for low-income housing, as opposed to single older people who can't live in group home, like group living situations. And it actually would take the low-income housing and make it more of, if you want to live in low-income housing, you have to have roommates and live with a bunch of people.
If I could just address this point, I think is an important one to discuss, because when a household is applying to rent a unit that is designated as inclusionary, they need to meet income, you know, be below a certain income level. And what I thought I heard you saying is that that might allow for recent college graduates perhaps to qualify, I think is what you were getting at, or maybe even current college students?
Yeah, I mean, I understand, I guess low-income college students deserve as much access to support as anyone, having been a low-income college student myself. But if all of the units, if we end up building more 4-bedroom units in order to satisfy, you know, these inclusionary zoning requirements, there's more people who are low income will have to live in sort of group living situations, as opposed to having access to 1-bedroom units. I mean, I'm interested to understand how that fits in to this.
Well, if I could just give an example at where this provision, which is really just the one that is starts with notwithstanding the foregoing, correct? I think that's what we're focused on. When I think of the development on North Avenue at Cambrian Rise, the market development featured really quite small units and was paired with or in tandem with the affordable development, which had larger units in that instance. So in that instance, you had the affordable developer developing some ones, some studios, some ones and some twos, and really by and large the private development that occurred there was quite small studios and ones. And so this is just to acknowledge that there may be times when there's a bit of a mismatch kind of in a direction that you might not otherwise think is likely to happen, but it's really just to allow for that greater flexibility. But as Megan said, as we go further through this process, it may not be as critical that this change be included in what you finally adopt, I think.
Yeah, and this, to be clear, this came up not because of the same kinds of requests that we were hearing or seeing from the considerations for the uniqueness of the City Place project and how it's evolving. This was actually something that we had known was potentially a barrier in other cases. And so we figured if we were talking about these standards, that we could address this on both ends, both where it wants to be bigger and where it wants to be smaller. But yeah, it's very possible that we can rely just on the flexibility that we're offering for bedroom mix without needing to specify this as its own kind of
I'll hang
standard.
tight and listen to the rest of the presentation then.
Did Alex want to talk as well?
I do have one kind of related comment, which is just to underscore the fact that the affordable housing developers are the ones that are concerned largely about the unit mix, because they have investors, they have market studies, and they have a lot of concern about anything more than 2 bedrooms, basically, because of the waitlist dynamic that Brian described. So they're the ones that really feel like, you know, everyone's going to be put at ease if they can meet the market as they see it, and you know, reduce the apprehension on the part of their investors, be they tax credit or loan providers. Now, of course, vacancy is very low, and you know, that's kind of an easy market study to write in a lot of ways. But that, just to make sure roles and concerns of the related parties are appropriately described.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't know if you want to go back to Alex.
Yeah.
And Julia, we also
I had a question, Andy.
Okay, yeah, Alex, I think you wanted to speak. Julia, I'm hearing you might have wanted to as well, and Ben? Okay, why don't you guys go ahead?
So my question was basically like, I'm in favor of giving more flexibility to people who want to develop, you know, affordable housing or include some affordable units. The question is, what are the unintended consequences of making this change? It had to have been there originally for a reason. And are there experiences from other cities that are informative? Charles, Megan, do you have any thoughts about that?
So I'm sitting here with Brian Pine, who we also have started calling the city's historian in City Hall. But we are also fortunate that he has a long history with the inclusionary zoning ordinance as well. But I'll just say, I think, Alex, as it relates to this specific point, the intent of this standard originally was most likely, and Brian can confirm this, because at the time our ordinance was written, we were concerned that we may end up with really large market rate units and very small inclusionary ones. And so I don't think that our ordinance at the time contemplated a situation where the opposite might be true, or even not at the extremes, like even just inclusionary units that might be slightly larger than market units. And so I think the unintended consequence here is enabling them to be larger. I think Emily pointed out something that we hadn't really thought about before, but I think we still have all of the same requirements in terms of income limits and rent limits that would be applicable. But I just think that this standard was written in a different era when our concerns were different.
When family sizes were larger.
I was just going to say that too, and I think Megan summed it up well, but you're right, the demographic shift had not really begun. Remember, this was adopted in 1990. Things were a bit different. Household formation rates, which sounds really nerdy, but it really is when people get together and actually form households, started moving progressively later. And whereas people in the previous generation were forming households in their 20s, sometimes early mid-20s, it was moving to late 20s, early 30s, and now it's moved firmly into the mid-30s. So it really does affect household size and what people are looking for at that stage in their life.
Thank you.
My comment's been addressed, so carry on.
Yeah, and same here. Alex actually asked my question, so if there's if there's still more presentation, why don't we go back to that?
All right, moving along. I think we've discussed this such that this example, I think we've talked about this sort of example. So I'll go to the next item. So bedroom mix. So the ordinance requires the bedroom mix again in the inclusionary component of a project to match that of the market rate component of a project. So this proposal would say that in lieu of meeting that compliant and of that standard, an alternative compliance method would be where the gross floor area of all of the inclusionary affordable units is greater than the percent that is outlined in that table that's dictating the percentage of affordable units. If that is higher, if that gross floor area is higher than that percent, then the bedroom mix can differ. So for example, if an inclusionary zoning requirement is 15% and an affordable component is 17% of the gross floor area of all of the residential units, then the bedroom mix can be altered. And again, this would address projects where there's an abundance of, let's say, very large units that are 4 bedrooms, and there's simply no demand for those in the affordable housing market. It would allow for affordable housing development in those situations. Co-housing is another that we've seen increasingly in other cities that may be coming to Burlington, where there's, let's say, 4 or 5, even more bedrooms, and folks are sharing a kitchen or even sharing some bathrooms across units. This would provide a pathway for IZ to achieve some affordability. So an example of a project here. So today, if let's say there's a project with 100 units total and a 15% IZ requirement. So today, if let's say the developer wants to build a lot of 4-bedroom units, so 85 of those 100 would be 4 bedrooms, and 15 would be also 4 bedrooms. But again, there's no demand for that. Champlain Housing Trust has told us, communicated to us, that there's no wait list for 4 units, and they couldn't see themselves contemplating developing 4-bedroom affordable units. So the proposal would allow, in lieu of that, let's say, where those 85 units are each, let's say, 1,200 square feet for a total of just over 102,000 square feet gross floor area. It would say if the IZ units can achieve at least 15.5% of that floor area of the residential units, then the bedroom mix can differ. So let's then say instead of the 15 4-bedroom affordable units, that developer could then develop 20 in-demand 1-bedroom units at 600 square feet and 5 2-bedroom units at 762 square feet for a total of 15.5% of the residential component. So that would essentially get us more affordable units, and most likely would be all sort of in-demand types. So that is that's the proposal. So how do peer cities sort of regulate bedroom mix? South Burlington requires that the sort of average, and they use mean number of bedrooms in the inclusionary units shall be no less than the average number of bedrooms in the market rate units. New York City establishes minimum bedroom mix proportions, so they're looking for at least 50% 2 bedrooms plus, 75% 1 bedroom plus. But New York City notably does allow for multiple exemptions to these standards. If you're interested, we can bring those to your next discussion, but they are many. Boston has a sort of nebulous inclusionary zoning program that uses, let me just get this out of my way. Inclusionary units must be consistent in bedroom count and includes the following sort of requirements. So Boston will allow inclusionary units to be provided on-site or off-site, and off-site units must reflect or be preferable to the mix of market rate units, where preferable in Boston essentially means a higher percentage of units with 2+ bedrooms. I take it there's a particular need for those family size units in Boston. Okay, so that is it for the bedroom mix. If there's any questions online or in here.
Any questions of Brian?
This point that I'm going to share is really something that we've only encountered on a few occasions, and it's where the developer makes their calculations and comes to our office and says, here's what I think is going to be required of us. And the problem with their calculations are that when they're calculating the average unit rent or sale price, they include what they have determined the inclusionary prices will be in their calculation. And even it doesn't say anywhere in the ordinance how to do that, but I think we need to clarify that when you're doing that calculation, it should be the average of the market rate units. But it's nowhere is it spelled. That was something we wanted to clear up, and I don't think we did that in here. So, unless you tell me differently.
So, are you talking about how they calculate 15% of GFA? Because we have, so just for the commission, the concern that Brian just shared about calculating the rents, for example, is something that we know about. And for transparency, we do plan to bring you another package of corrections to IZ at some point in the future. So that issue that Brian just mentioned about how the IZ rents factor into the average rents for a project is something we'll talk to you about in the future. But Brian has flagged the same kind of question, and I was just thinking the same thing when you were giving your example about whether the percentage of the gross floor area that has to be occupied by inclusionary units includes all of the units in the project or only the market rate units in a project. And so the way this is written says that the inclusionary gross floor area has to be 15% of all the residential units in the project, not just of the market rate units. So it is specific to that, unless people feel it should be otherwise, but it is supposed to be 15% of all.
Why not clear it up now, or is that going to take too long?
Alex asked, why not do the cleanup now?
Because, as you can imagine, the more things we tackle, the harder this is.
We're told to keep it discreet.
Could I?
We've got Ben.
Sorry, Alex, you couldn't probably hear my sarcastic remark, which was not appropriate.
I heard it.
Okay. But I will say that we actually have a large number of technical corrections and other clarifications that we want to make, and we think that one is actually more of a clarification. So we didn't feel that we have ways of dealing with it right now in terms of the administration of the ordinance, but we think it's an important clarification to make as part of that package. And Ben does have his hand up. Andy. Go ahead, Ben.
Thanks, Megan. And first of all, let me say that I'm so impressed already with the expertise demonstrated by you planning commissioners and your questions. So let me apologize in advance if I'm asking a question that's not quite up to the level that you all are operating on here. But I guess just to sort of put it out there before you move into the gross floor area discussion of the presentation. So when I was first looking at the proposed changes, I suppose one of the questions that came to my mind was, well, why don't we just get rid of the bedroom mix requirement altogether for all projects and not do this square footage analysis? If affordable housing developers are saying that they just, in whatever project it may be, they want to be able to develop the units that are in demand, why don't we just go ahead and do that? My guess, though, and I would appreciate your feedback on that, is that the reason why we don't want to do that is because there's some concern that then an affordable housing developer may simply meet their 15% unit demand by building all small efficiency apartments. My question then is, and I think this goes to Sharon Busher's point in public comment as well, is as we move into the gross floor area discussion, I understand that by allowing units to be less than that 90% threshold in the example that you just showed there, it would, for those developers that are then meeting that square footage amount by building smaller units, it may result in there being more units overall in that equation. Again, we're talking about sort of smaller. The example that you used was a 600 square foot type apartment. And as I look at the regulations as existed prior to this proposed amendment, again, there appears to have been some consideration here that sort of as a public policy standpoint, we didn't want folks in affordable housing units to sort of be in those smaller efficiency type apartments. And I know that we say that they're in demand, but I'm assuming that, if you gave someone who's looking for a 1-bedroom affordable housing unit the option of, do you want to be in the 600 square foot 1-bedroom studio, or do you want to be in the 1,000 square foot 1-bedroom studio, then the choice would be to be in the larger unit. And that's, again, I think from a policy standpoint, probably why we have that 90% number, so that such that folks are not in much smaller units than similar bedroom market unit areas. So I guess that's just what I would like to focus on. I know we're talking about sort of in demand here, but from a policy standpoint, is there some concern that by adding this second part on gross floor area, that we are, allowing affordable housing developers to really build sort of much smaller efficiency units that, yes, may be in demand, but may not be what folks are really looking for and what they're available to get now under the current ordinance. Sorry, that's long-winded and rambling, but I hope it made sense.
The whole reason that this exists both in Burlington and other places is because of this concept of like a pour door or like things that are very, painful. And so it is important to have some parity or equity there. And so I think that's just worth articulating and sort of like, not completely throwing out the whole bedroom mix matching that previously existed.
Andy? So I'd like to talk about what I'm not hearing in this conversation is an understanding and or an analysis of costs and rents. Because, with great respect, the reason why units are getting smaller is because it's harder and harder and harder for developers, and I don't mean the public sector, I mean the private sector, to make the numbers work. When it's costing, at this point, $235, $245 a square foot for a private developer to put up a building and build apartments. You start doing the math, and the rents that you need to charge go up, and the size of the units has to go down, because the only way to get to a level where the deal pencils is to make the units smaller so you can get more of them. So it has nothing to do with, I mean, yes, you could say that there is a general market trend towards people thinking that smaller is better. But to Ben's point, if you have the opportunity to rent 1,000 square feet versus 600 square feet, anybody is going to go for that 1,000 square feet. Most likely, there'll be a few outliers, but the reality is that, and again, I'm saying this from my perspective, but the demand for lots of bedrooms, I think it was Megan who said that, CHT has said, we have no waiting list for units that size. They're not in demand, and they're not. So I guess, I do understand the idea that particularly among some of the new American families, people with lots of kids, there is a need for more bedrooms than what's being offered in the current mix. But I guess what I would say is, this all sounds wonderful, but at the end of the day, it costs money. And it has to make financial sense. And I guess that's what I'd like to bring us back to is, sure, can this make sense? Yes, but maybe there's some sort of a bonus you could give people for building units that have lots of bedrooms. Rather than demand it, incentivize it. But if you talk to any developer about what they're going to build, they're going to tell you, I'm building 1-bedroom studios and maybe a few twos. Why? Because when somebody leaves that apartment, the next person coming along is going to want it, and they have to want it. And that's what the market is asking for. They're not asking for 3-bedroom. They're not asking for 4-bedroom. They're not asking for 5-bedroom.
Eves, I'd say the only exception to that, and maybe Emily referred to this a little bit, in the college student area, that's going to be the opposite dynamic. The rest of the city, 1s and 2s are prevalent for that reason because of construction costs. The other thing I think, I think you're right with one sliver of an exception there. The other thing I would say that's important to recognize is how these get developed. The larger developments like Cambrian Rise, for a lot of reasons, including that the affordable housing developers are better at managing the developments. Folks at Cambrian Rise would rather have a separate building, equally as nice, but built and managed and financed using their financing by CHT or someone like CHT. So who's building the inclusionary units in those larger projects are nonprofits. Now remember, this is triggered at 4 units. After 4, you build it. Who's building them in the smaller ones are folks that are not as savvy about all these things, perhaps, because they're not professional developers with finance people in their offices as much. So it's a different dynamic there. Those are built probably by the developers, and maybe, Brian, you could speak to that. Is that right, or is that kind of right?
Every development is just a little bit unique, so it's not always the best idea for me to try and offer. When you look at one of the largest recent developments before Cambrian, it was the redevelopment on Patchen Road, Grove Street in Burlington, of course. SD Ireland had owned the property, so they had no cost basis in the land, so they were able to make all of their inclusionary units were within their buildings, and they handled all of them there. Eric's model, which he actually pioneered at the Bank North property, is where it started, honestly. Heinz Lofts happened, and right next door is 88 King, where there's 24 apartments that Champlain Housing Trust developed, and that met the inclusionary requirement of Heinz Lofts. That was the first significant development where that occurred. So I guess I'd say that you're correct, and I think Michael was getting at this earlier, that when you have developments where the developer's just meeting the 15% and that's usually an in-house finance deal where they're including those units in their building. They're just handling the fact that it does depress their income stream over time, and they've built that into their business model. But when a project is done like where City Place is coming online with, or will come online with, the affordable inclusionary component being built and financed by CHT as a standalone entity, I mean, I think we're, you know, I think that's probably the most likely development scenario we're going to see for the foreseeable future, is that approach.
Well, and I'm sorry, I would jump in, Brian, because I agree with you. I think that if there's a building where that's the mix, that makes a lot of sense. But I have a challenge imagining a bunch of 1-bedrooms and studios with a 4-bedroom thrown in the mix that's filled with college students. I mean, or anybody in a 4-bedroom, because, you know, realistically, if you can all think back to when you were in college or other times, the more people you pack into an apartment, the louder and the rowdier and the whatever it's going to be. I mean, unless you're all in Jesuit school. It's the nature of the beast. And so, you know, if you have units in a building that are, you know, if you build a building and say, this is a family building, this is where families are going to live, this is where, that makes a lot of sense. But again, I think that, you know, what we're looking to do makes sense. We just have to be very careful how we do it and not do it in such a way, because this has the potential to help our housing issue, but done incorrectly, it can harm our housing issue. Because what the market can't really bear right now, between the taxes, the cost of material, the unavailability of labor, and now interest rates, is another layer of cost that makes it harder for developments to pencil. And Brian, you know that. That's, you know, it's elemental at this point, because at this point, you know, I'll be very honest with all of you, it's extraordinarily skinny to make any of these deals work in terms of building housing in this market because of the costs associated. And, you know, we've plateaued in terms of rents. I mean, we're charging Boston rents. You know, it's $2,000 a month for a 600 square foot studio, never mind a 1-bedroom.
So Julia, we do see your hand up if you want to go.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to come back to the, you know, original reason for hearing this now, which is the City Place development. And I don't know if it's, you know, fully been acknowledged in this conversation that, you know, the desire of that developer is to have the larger bedroom mix, you know, additional bedrooms for the market rate units, which is not, you know, the mix that they are going for the inclusionary units, unless I'm completely misunderstanding that. And also that this is a situation that sounds similar to the Cambrian Rise development, in that the affordable units will be in a separate structure managed by CHT. I just want to confirm that I'm understanding that right. And then the other thing I wanted to raise is just a question about minimum unit size requirements, and if that is another element to this conversation that can support, you know, the parity and dignity of affordable units compared to market rate units, that kind of pairs with this bedroom mix conversation, but obviously is not a substitute for it. So does the city have any current ordinances that cover minimum unit size by bedroom? And I'm sorry that I don't know that off the top of my head right now.
You shouldn't know that off the top of your head. That's totally fine.
One thing I want to say is this, I was on the Inclusionary Committee, a lot of debate, a lot of really good debate, and there was a unit size requirement, but because our ordinance is so slow to react to the marketplace, the unit size requirement was impossible for Brian to administer because it was beyond what anything was produced in the market. And I think a 1-bedroom had to be 1,100 square feet or something silly that for many years was no longer in existence. So I'd be reluctant at least in the zoning ordinance, to put a requirement of a minimum size, because I think we'll be back in the same place, but it'll be too late. By the time we react, we've lost many, many units because developers just, whether affordable or not, the sort of the market conditions are right for them and they do it, or they don't and move to another market and build it.
Yeah, so you can see here on the screen, these are the former minimum unit sizes that were required for IZ before 2019, as Bruce was just mentioning. You can also see an example that Charles pulled for for New York City. Not really that different from the standards we used to have, but we did hear a lot of concern through that process about eliminating these static minimum sizes and using something different. The other thing that we did look at earlier today is just that outside of the zoning ordinance, we do have minimum housing codes that have minimum unit sizes from a habitability and safety perspective. So this is what you see here on the screen. These would be much smaller than the sizes we're talking about, but these are the minimum life safety standards in our housing code.
150 is really low.
Yeah, again,
Well,
these are just
I understand.
housing safety
Yep.
standards.
Yeah, I understand, but
It's per occupant, though.
I mean, I did live in that my freshman year of college, but yeah.
That is per occupant.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is, per person.
So that'd be, okay. Still.
Still small, but yeah, not 150.
I guess, could I ask a question? Sorry. Little difficult to know with their hand raised. I would be reluctant to change the unit mix parity under the 15% because of the reasons we just said. Because if you're going over 15%, you really are in a situation where you have a affordable housing specialist involved. But since we're doing this, and I don't want to go too out of scope, but is it a possibility that you could have something where they want to build, where we get in the same situation, but it's less than 15%? You know what I mean? So is it worthwhile we're kind of just making small changes to say up to three bedrooms in terms of parity if it's less than 15%? I mean, I don't know that situation exists or that you have something in the pipeline, but.
You can do less than 15.
Yeah, do you mean 15%? Like 15%?
Can you guys speak into the microphones?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry,
Thank
Alex. 15% is the minimum that anyone can do.
Understood.
Okay.
But so we're saying if you go over 15%, you have this flexibility, right, on unit mix, where so long as you're providing the right gross square footage, but under 15%, could we envision a scenario in relatively short time where there's obviously some sort of market for 4-bedroom, right? Like we're totally at capacity on student housing. And so could you envision a scenario where if they're building 15% exactly, and we run into a similar situation where they're saying, well, I can't have parity within the building of a 4-bedroom. That just doesn't make any sense. I don't know. I'm just wondering out loud if while we're making these small changes, I'm again hesitant to change the parity within within the 15%, but should we make a change that says up to 3 bedrooms or something like that? I'm just wondering because we've had this because we're now observing this change in the market, right? That could come back in relatively short order.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question that we could put a little more thought into. I think I'm following the point that you're making, which is essentially right now the way that this proposal is structured is we're creating 2 tiers. You're either allocating at least 15.5% of the gross floor area of all your residential units, and allowed to have greater flexibility in the bedroom mix and size, or if you're under that percent of your gross floor area, you have to meet all of our existing requirements. In terms of, the bedroom mixes have to be the same and the unit sizes have to be at least 90% of the market. So you're saying within that lower tier, see if there's more flexibility to offer as well. Only for really large units, right? Okay. Okay, yeah, I mean, that is a question that we kind of started with is is the problem really just at the largest end of the market rate units? versus across the board. So yeah, we could put some more thought into that question.
One thing I think, and this was from the mayor last time, I think it's important as much as we can to stick to this.
Understood.
And the reason, I'm going to give you another reason, which is there are things inside this inclusionary ordinance, if you gave Brian an afternoon, he would like fixed. And, or maybe a few afternoons. And for example, it says that more than one project within a year by any applicant or developer or something like that, total, I don't know how he could, what's the year mean? What's the applicant mean? What's the responsible party, I think the term is. What's responsible party mean? There's no way he can administer that the same way I did. Do you agree with that? I mean, Brian, I mean, it's just, there's things like that. We should technically go in and try to define terms and fix them, and this may be on the list.
No, I definitely hear you. I don't want to open the Pandora's box, but it is directly related to unit size and unit mix, and that's the only reason it comes to mind.
Yeah, Bruce, I'll just say that's another thing that's on our radar. So,
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead, Emily.
No, your hand's been up for a while. You go ahead.
Okay, I just, similarly, I don't want to open Pandora's box, but it is related to, unit configurations. I wonder how this ordinance treats, changes over time, future conversions, particularly in response to the market in like a similar way that we're seeing right now. Yeah, that's just a question. And I know that, that's beyond the scope of this immediate change, but it's also, this has implications into the future related to, unit ratios as they change in the future. So.
And so this new idea in architecture of flex walls, to be able to have a two-bedroom that could become a one-bedroom, it seems like that might be something that builders could consider in order to work with, changing, requirements. And then the second thing, as Julia mentioned, that the IZ units are in a different building. Is that the case? Can somebody explain that to me?
So, do you want to talk about this, or do you want me to talk about this?
Sure. It's at the option or the discretion of what the developer proposes and what the DRB approves. It is allowed that they be in separate buildings. And Michael spoke a little bit about the financing of affordable housing. And if you are a private developer who acquires land, holds the land, does permitting, does infrastructure, and then makes available a pad, if you will, a section of your property for the affordable housing, you usually transact that, you make that transaction in such a way that is concessionary, basically. You lower the price enough to make it work for the affordable housing developer. That developer needs to ensure to the tax credit investors that they're developing something that is a sort of a standalone. They can't scatter the units about in market rate buildings and hope that they work things out. So that is ultimately what the financing structure requires. Or there are developers who've managed to put the inclusionary units sprinkled about their building because they haven't chosen that other approach. It's usually smaller developments that the developer keeps their inclusionary units in-house, and then the larger properties will involve a third party that does the affordable units in a separate building.
Okay, and I just was curious because of the word inclusionary and inclusionary zoning, and it sounds like it can be exclusionary as well, depending on the developer.
I think the idea, and it's a good point, but I think the idea is to have economically diverse and integrated areas and neighborhoods, not necessarily to say that every single building itself needs to meet that. So it's the idea that you don't have exclusive neighborhoods, not necessarily focused on what address you're at, but really what neighborhood.
I don't see any hands up currently.
I have
Sorry, Emily. Go ahead.
Question. I guess I'm looking for information about what does the low-income housing world need in Burlington? I feel like I'm hearing conflicting things here. I'm hearing we need larger units, and then we don't need larger units because there's no demand for it. So, and I see that it seems like some of the floor rate ratio ideas do result in more units being created. So how are we measuring our success? Like, is it the number of people that are housed? Is it the type of units that are most needed? So I guess, Brian, can you just tell me, like, what is our community need right now so that we can be sure that this is doing it? Because I don't feel like it's being said very clearly.
That's a big question, Emily. What does our community need in terms of housing? We do have, a demographic shift that is going to continue on for quite some time, and that is the aging of our population. So our housing needs are very much shifting, and the homes that are owned and occupied by either one or two people who are elderly, there's still a very significant number of starter homes in Burlington that still are occupied by households who've been there 40 or 50 years and their kids are long gone, and they don't have a lot of options. And so there's a huge need for decent quality new rental housing for seniors to be able to move and open up those starter homes again for families to kind of do that recycle of hopefully bringing new families into neighborhoods, into homes. But if you look at the waiting lists as one way to see what your demand is, the demand continues to be for the 1 and 2 bedroom units. You could fill 1 bedroom units. A market study will show you can fill 1 bedroom units all day long in this community. You could do 2 bedroom units at a pretty high level. Once you get above that, numbers just don't support a lot of new development unless you're marketing to a niche that is primarily the student niche, and that's where larger bedroom configurations do work.
And
So
just,
when I saw the ratio,
the only thing I was going to add, Emily, just for clarity, when we've been talking about larger units in the context of the first change in particular, we're not necessarily envisioning that this means 4-bedroom units, for example. We've really been thinking about even just situations where market rate might be studio and 1-bedrooms and inclusionary could be 1 and 2s. So we're not talking about really dramatically larger units.
Sure. I guess I'm always looking for the loophole here, like that developer is going to meet the floor area requirement of 15% by putting in 4-bedroom units, because then it's the fewest number of units to put in, and it's the lowest cost when our community just doesn't need 4-bedroom units to be low-income housing. But when I look at the floor area ratio example that you gave earlier, that showed that alternate path, it seemed like it actually created more units. So that seems like an obvious good thing if this one right here, yeah, the one back one slide. It seems like it creates more units. They're 1 and 2 bedroom units, which is, I'm hearing, what our community needs. So I guess I don't have any issue with this type of, this being allowed as an exemption. I am concerned about, the large units being used as a workaround to the square foot. So I guess I'd like to hear more about how, maybe see something like this that shows how it could be met in different ways if we allow the increase in bedrooms and larger units.
I think that to your point about somebody building larger units to satisfy the requirement, but potentially resulting in fewer units than they would have otherwise been required anyway, is that kind of what you're saying?
Right.
Yeah,
and then having units built that aren't really that useful to our community, right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'd say probably nobody really wants to build units that they can't fill, if they can't fill them, right? But I think what I've been hearing Bruce and Eves and maybe Brian to some degree saying is that the 4-bedroom units actually become harder to build, especially when you think about building them at inclusionary rates, that the delta between what you can charge and what it actually costs to build those units is bigger than when the units are smaller. Is that right? Bruce is nodding his head at me. So I think I'm struggling to see like where the incentive would be for someone to build just like a few 4-bedroom units that they are concerned they might not fill.
The difference is pretty dramatic, Brian.
Yeah.
I can't remember the numbers, but
I don't have the inclusionary rents memorized, but Bruce is correct that the delta gets more significant. It's actually quite small at the 1-bedroom and studio level. The difference is quite small. It's when you get to the much bigger units. And obviously, developers are in business, and their financiers aren't interested in developments that don't kick off enough cash to make it a good investment. So there's probably not, I don't think there's a whole lot of risk that developers will be seeking to take a loophole route that gets lots of units that aren't really, that there's no demand for. I don't think that's a very likely outcome.
Okay.
At this stage, do we feel like we need to talk about the last one? Maybe you could just say what the last one is. I think it's, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's
Okay.
worth continuing and finishing up the presentation, so that we have everything in front of us.
Right, so we've sort of talked about this issue, but the third and final component of this is that it relates to a current requirement that the inclusionary units can be no smaller than 90% of the average gross floor area of market rate unit with the same bedroom number. So a 1-bedroom IZ unit can be no smaller than the average, of 90% of the market rate 1-bedrooms, and so on and so forth as you go up. So this proposal takes a similar approach to the previous one, where the gross floor area of those inclusionary units is greater than the IZ percent that's required for that project. Then the units can be of a different size. It doesn't prescribe what that size might be. It just says that the size can be different. And so again, using a student housing example, where those units might be 1,200 square feet, you get a whole host of potential options or scenarios where the inclusionary units might be significantly smaller, half the size, but again, you're likely going to be ending up ultimately with more affordable units in that scenario.
Charles, I have one question, and maybe it's for Brian too. Isn't there also a phasing issue? If we're here to solve the problem of multiple buildings on a lot, and if you think about, and you're building 4 buildings on a site, the inclusionary developer may not be in sync, or their funding source may not be in sync with when the market rate units can be produced, and we're forcing them to build them all at the same time, and it may not, in an urban setting, you may not be able to get enough big yellow trucks on the site to build them all at one time. So do we still have a phasing issue for, just like we have these 2 issues?
We don't believe so. We have worked through this issue with a number of folks, including with our permitting and inspections department. And I think a really helpful reference point for us, again, just because Cambrian Rise has been such a different type of project for our community to see come online under these ordinances, has provided a helpful reference point in that the conditions of approval for that project did facilitate several phases of market rate development before inclusionary units were originally planned to be created. The conditions of approval, though, did acknowledge that those inclusionary units were going to come online within the first couple of years of construction. And so that was something that the DRB had deemed as appropriate for allowing the different types of buildings and types of units that were going to be created across that project. Ultimately, that project's funding opportunities changed, and both inclusionary buildings ended up getting built before the other market rate any of the other market rate buildings, I should say. So it worked out slightly differently. But particularly in situations where, as we've talked before, you have multiple development partners using different types of funding sources, we think that that provides a good roadmap for how a phasing plan could be approved for future projects like it.
I can't find the provision now, but are you saying that the DRB has discretion under the current wording of the
To
ordinance?
approve a phasing plan.
Right.
Yep.
Ben, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So this is probably highly technical, but sort of doubling back to the First Amendment, which is to allow for projects to always build inclusionary units that contain more bedrooms, regardless of whether or not they meet this 15% threshold. It theoretically would allow for the construction of a larger bedroom unit without hitting that 15% threshold, and that larger bedroom unit does not have a correlating unit within the building. And so there's some confusion then to your point as to if there is no other apartment or unit in the building to determine what that 90% number is, then there's some, I think there may be some questions here as to sort of what is the threshold in that case, where you don't hit that 15% square footage threshold, but you have decided to build a larger bedroom unit, but you don't have that correlating unit within the project.
This split in this table is just in a very inconvenient location. Sorry. Yeah, no, I think that that's a great point, Ben. I think in that case, you know, the 15%, yeah, as you've acknowledged, the gross floor area does not necessarily apply if someone is not seeking to essentially build units in the opposite direction. But I think the more we've talked through this, I think we've acknowledged that probably the second two provisions, allowing flexibility within those could satisfy what we were trying to achieve with that first one as well. So may not be as applicable going forward. So I think we, as a staff, we would be fine with taking that first change out and relying only on the other two.
So, first, Charles, are you all set with your presentation? Was that?
Yes, we are all set.
Okay. Then where do we go from here? There's been a lot of feedback. Does the commission or the counselors have any additional feedback you want to give on what we've heard so far? We were chiming in a lot during the whole presentation, but is there anyone in remote land that wants to speak out?
I just have a quick question about like parity and, you know, if there are other changes that need to be made to the ordinance, or if these address, like, you know, the ordinance, the way it communicates a standard of parity between the affordable units and the market rate units. Are there other things to be clarified regarding that standard, or is this sufficient? Or is that something that we will look at later down the line, you know, when we're looking at things of a broader scope related to this ordinance beyond just this bedroom mix issue?
Right, so today there is some required parity, and I think, you know, Brian could probably speak more to this, better to this than I can, but the parity, we feel that, you know, the parity standards that are in the ordinance today are sufficient, and I think if we did need to take a deeper look, which I don't think we anticipate at this time, you know, we could do this at this later phase that we've talked about. But yeah, you know, unit finishes, that sort of thing. You know, Michael mentioned, you know, the pour door, those sorts of things typically aren't permitted.
And energy efficiency has to be at least as comparable or better.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you can hear Brian, but in the ordinance, the proposed amendments that are in your packet, the one directly, well, it would be letter E now in these proposed amendments, speak towards, you know, the differences in the general appearance, the exterior appearance, as well as the performance of the systems of the units. So those are standards that are already in the ordinance.
Thanks.
Thank
Was
you.
there, Julia, does you still have?
No, thank you.
Okay. Was there anybody else who wants to chime in on any of this? So just, I think, you know, this may be more of a, well, Megan, did you? Yeah, but I just have one really brief comment, which is, and this may be more for our discussion that's going to be coming up in the future on the missing middle, but just hearing the lack of need for the larger units, the 3 or 4 bedroom units, just raises all sorts of questions for me about the mix of our community, which is,
Well,
if we want to be like a community that supports families and has strong schools, the larger units are really, not even large units, but 3, 4 bedroom units is what most families with small kids or medium-sized kids want. So as we get to the broader housing discussions, we're going to want to make sure that we keep that in mind. And again, I'm not sure that's really part of the discussion that we're having tonight on the inclusionary zoning, but, and it may be that we really need to look at our existing stock that is already there to make sure that we are able to preserve those as the 3, 4 plus bedrooms for the families. But we want to make sure that those stay affordable, those stay accessible, those stay available to people who want to be in Burlington with families who go to the schools. Otherwise, I think Sharon would be right that we just become like a bedroom community for other areas around us. So not really part of the inclusionary zoning, I don't think. Maybe it is, but something to really keep in mind. These were some interesting statistics that we were hearing tonight.
And yeah, I think you make an excellent point, and I think that the 3-bedroom thing, as someone who was looking for a 3-bedroom house with a young family, like that was extremely hard. And I pushed some housing developers and affordable housing developers in town on this point to say, is that true? Because, you know, the first thing you do when you do a market study is you look at what already exists, right? Like, you don't look at what might exist, you look at what already exists. And they really reiterated that in this market segment, that's where the demand is. But I think you're right to say that we still need to be focused on it as a community. And I take Brian's point about allowing people that would otherwise be starter homes to move to a new location to then have, you know, some filtering of housing and to allow, you know, these smaller homes to open up for families, because I think it's, I'm very happy you're focused on that.
One thing I'll say is executive committee authorized ordinance to start talking about some of these little tweaks that may have big impacts in the ordinance. And Charles and I have been trying to line up a meeting and so we can share some thoughts on that. So it may be bubbling up to you from ordinance, planning commission ordinance, including a discussion of FAR instead of dwelling units per acre in certain zones. Some of the demand is based on the zone. Around the university, it's different than the New North End. And so I think, but we've taken a blanket approach of dwelling units per acre in all of our residential zones, which doesn't make a lot of sense from my perspective, but I think we should at least have that debate. And you may be seeing a proposal from ordinance and staff on that.
Just the commission, I believe, took a huge step recently with the approval of the Trinity zoning, rezoning, because we have lots of big 3 and 4 bedrooms. They're just occupied by a different population that it'd be great to find purpose-built, incentives to build purpose-built student housing, both on campus and off, so that folks will make room for the uses that were historically intended, and the neighborhoods are begging for more diversity of household types. And
I think what it would also do is allow the market to demand, for the producers of housing to produce what the market's demanding, not what the regulatory environment, in some cases, gets in the way of producing. Yeah. And particularly with there are areas where there's a large demand for 1 bedrooms and they're not being produced, and there are areas where there's a larger demand for 3 bedrooms and they're not being produced. And there are some, I think, technical areas of the ordinance. If it's demanded at a high rate, it should be produced unless the regulatory environment's stopping it, and it's stopping it in some places.
Yeah, I think not to belabor this point too much, but Bruce is touching on something that has been a goal in our comprehensive plan for a while now, which is to think about a different standard than dwelling units per acre as the way we regulate building intensity, essentially. It's something we're using as a proxy for how big or how bulky buildings are rather than necessarily about what's happening inside of a building. And so this is something that will definitely be a central point of the missing middle work. I know it's come up in some of our other conversations as well, is what's a better way for us to achieve what we want buildings to look and feel like, but not so much micromanaging what they're doing on the inside. So, so I don't know, do you want to bring it back to this amendment?
Sorry, I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to sidetrack us on that, but it's just something I think important for us to all keep our focus on as we're dealing with all different aspects of the housing issues. But Megan and Charles, if you want to just, if you have thoughts of where we're moving from here on this, it seems like there's some changes that were talked about tonight, so we'd need to see a new version of this coming back to us. And also just, this is our first meeting with, our joint meeting with the Ordinance Committee and the Commission, and are you envisioning more of these? Because it might be helpful to continue with at least the inclusionary zoning discussion that we're having.
Yeah, so I think we've heard enough about revisions that both the Ordinance Committee and Planning Commission would like to see, and so we can bring a revised amendment back to the Planning Commission at your meeting next week on the 24th. I think we did anticipate having at least one more joint meeting of these two bodies. I do know that the City Council Ordinance Committee will not be able to sort of accommodate that until after the first week of February. So I think at the earliest it would be the week of February 6th when we'd be able to have an Ordinance Committee meeting. I think Zariah is traveling and won't be back until early February.
Does it? Sorry, just on that timeline, pardon my ignorance, because I think this is the first one I've attended that's a joint meeting, but is it something where we could move it at our next meeting rather than having to reassemble this joint committee?
Yes, I mean, you technically could warn a public hearing tonight for February 14th if you wanted to. At the meeting next week on the 24th, I think if you were to warn a hearing, you could still get it on the February 14th public hearing date. So we'd be happy to bring a revised amendment. The Planning Commission, you all could warn that public hearing for the 14th. The City Council Ordinance Committee can have their discussions, but ultimately, if at the public hearing you were to recommend that it go to the City Council, then it would go ultimately back to the Council and probably the Ordinance Committee itself.
Are we close enough to warn it now? Because we can make changes during debate.
Yeah, that's right. I mean,
the public hearing.
It sounds like there are, because we're stripping out like 1/3 of the major changes that are being proposed, I do think it's often better to have a more finalized version that we warn for public hearing, because that's what we want to put out to the public to have the comment on. Like the version that's right now, we would have to say, warn something, but we want you to change it before it gets put out to the public. Sure. I just think it's a much, much better practice to have something that's much closer to what we actually intend to present to the public.
Hey, Andy.
Yes.
I don't mean to be contrary, but this is a relatively big one, and if we can get back together with Ordinance Committee the second week in February, I think it would realistically, my fellow commissioners, I think if we get Ordinance Committee buy-in, it might seem like our process is a little bit slower, but I think the overall process would be more rapid. So just putting that out there for thought, that having everybody here allows us to get to a relative consensus, I feel, in a relatively quicker manner, because we all understand each other's perspectives and are part of the dialogue. So if it is something that we want to fast track, counterintuitively, it might be more efficient time-wise to do it with the Ordinance Committee than without.
I'm not hearing from tonight's discussion very much of a divergence between what the ordinance committee and what the planning commission have been saying. So I'm not really too worried at this stage about crossing paths on that one. I just think that it would be a better practice, whether we do it jointly with the ordinance committee at our next meeting or just with the commission, to have the version to warn for public hearing that we actually want to warn for public hearing. And so when is our next meeting at this point? Are we still scheduled for next week or?
Yeah,
Okay.
Tuesday, the 24th.
Okay, so we're still scheduled to have our meeting next week on Tuesday, which is a lot of meetings that we've had in a fairly short time, but there's been a lot of important work that we've been doing. So that would just be my suggestion, to hold off on the warning at least until next week, when we could see what the final version looks like. And we could decide, and we could hear, I mean, I'd like to hear from the ordinance committee members who are here what your desire would be on this one as well. But
Thank you, Andy. I am so new to this process that this is my first time at a planning commission meeting. So I really appreciated the questions that were asked, and if Ben has questions, he should ask them. But I am also learning and an observer tonight. But thank you for making that time and space for me.
Ben? You.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So, yeah, I mean, obviously the proposed changes here are going to have broader effect into the future, but I'm also mindful of the reasons why we got together jointly here tonight, and we've talked about it in the context of City Place. And you know, my understanding is that there is some time sensitivity around that. So from my own perspective, I would want the ordinance committee to accommodate whatever process is going to be the most efficient towards our coming to resolution on this sooner rather than later. And I sort of defer to you and to staff as to what that would be, but we do want to accommodate that as soon as possible. The only other thing that I would add is that Councillor Hightower is the third member of the ordinance committee and is not here this evening. And my suggestion to staff would be, if possible, we could follow up with her between now and the next meeting to seek any additional feedback that she may have.
So one possible approach on this is we could have this back likely at our next meeting, which is on Tuesday. It would be ready if the commission would want to warn it for public hearing then. And then the ordinance committee members, you could certainly welcome to come during the public hearing portion of it and weigh in on it at that point. And if more changes need to be made, we could certainly make changes. And ultimately, once the commission is done with our work, what we do is send it to the city council. So you're the ones who ultimately would be adopting it and, well, doing the final consideration of it and adopting it. So you'll still have plenty of opportunities to take a look at it. So, you know, it does sound like there's a lot of time sensitivity here. We want to get this moving. We don't want to get it held up. So that might be a good approach to keep it moving, give everybody who's, you know, at the table here an opportunity to weigh in and have input on it while still continuing the process. Megan?
I was just going to say, logistically, for the ordinance committee members, the planning commission meets twice in February, on the 14th and the 28th. So after tonight's meeting, we could follow up with you to see when would be best for your participation. If you like the suggestion that Andy just offered, we could find which date would be best for your participation so we know when to set that hearing for. And I agree with what Andy said, that we could even consider having that hearing as another joint meeting. The Planning Commission is able to make changes to a zoning amendment after they hold that public hearing, but before they refer it to the council. That can happen the same night. So that would give the ordinance committee members another opportunity to weigh in on any other questions or changes you might want to see to this before it gets referred to the whole council. But that could be a way for us to kind of do both at the same time, keep this moving as well as keep your participation in the process.
For the process that we just laid out. Is there any concerns with that? And again, for people who are remote, I have a hard time seeing who all of you, whether you want to speak out or not, so feel free to just speak out.
I'm shaking my head, Andy.
Which way?
I'm saying I don't have any concerns with the process you just
Okay,
laid out.
good.
Thank you.
Good, thank you.
Ditto, ditto.
Okay,
Yep, sounds good.
good. So I think we have an action plan on this one. We'll see this back again at our next meeting, and the commission will then decide what it wants to do with it at that meeting. And from what I'm understanding and what my sense is, we'll probably be moving it forward to the public hearing, but that's to be seen at that meeting. Good. Anything else on this? All right, I don't think so. This has been really productive. Thanks again to the city councilors for joining us tonight. I think hearing your input on this is really helpful because it just helps us know that we're heading in a direction that is likely to be supported by at least some members of the council. So that's always good to know, especially on something that's as time sensitive and important as what this one is. So good. All right, we will close, unless there's anything further, we'll close that. And Brian, thank you also for being here. So we'll close this item. So we have to adjourn our joint meeting. But our next item was put on here in case there was time. We're usually trying not to continue on new items after around 8 o'clock. So is it possible to have this on our next agenda also on Tuesday? Is there a question?
May I kindly make just a request?
Yes.
I cannot make next Tuesday's meeting and feel very vested in this, so I was wondering if you would just allow the time to explain the small change that staff had,
Sure.
made rather.
Joint meeting? Yeah, so let me formally, if I hadn't said it, we've formally adjourned our joint meeting. And we're on then to item 5, which is proposed CDO amendment, ZA-23-01, South End Innovation District. And again, I am mindful of the time on this where we've tried not to move into new items after around 8 o'clock, but, okay. So yeah, why don't you, there's a request to just go through what the changes are and then we'll pick up our discussion at the next meeting. Oops, sorry.
That's all right. So I'll be very quick. So remember, you did make the decision to adopt all of the revisions that we suggested. So the final discussion was about the land use framework, and there were discussions about the ratio, there were discussions about particular uses, and so what we've brought back is essentially we have made these 3 changes here on the left. So the first and biggest one is reducing that ratio between primary and secondary uses from 1 to 1 to 1 to 2. So the example projects here, you can see to essentially achieve 10,000 square feet of those secondary uses, you would now need half of what you would have previously needed. So 5,000 square foot of artist space would get you 10,000 square feet of restaurant, so on and so forth. We have added health studio, which encompasses things like yoga studios into the secondary permitted uses. I think that was an oversight on our part. And Bruce, thank you. We did move parking lot and parking garage over to the primary permitted category, but also included a footnote that forbids counting the square footage of those parking uses in that ratio to achieve those secondary uses. Again, this is a sort of comparison of how the previous version and the current draft line up. So again, if a developer wants 10,000 square feet of restaurant space, they would previously have needed to provide 10,000 square feet of primary space, let's say artist studio, community garden. Now, just need that 5,000 square feet of artist studio. We think this still achieves the intent of the South End Innovation District, but it provides more flexibility in achieving that. And note that again, planned unit developments are permitted. So in the event that any of these large sites do come in a phased approach, these uses can sort of creatively be laid out across sites.
And then there is a draft memo in there just summarizing some of the other approaches that you talked about, but didn't necessarily ask us to incorporate in the ordinance. So it's at the very end. It's in a rough draft form, so.
I always miss the very end.
Yeah, and some of that involved, you know, we decided ultimately not to sort of take a fine-tooth comb to the use categories and say, well, let's move this use from secondary to primary.
Yeah, just to remove the requirement.
Yeah, that was basically it, or just to remove the requirement altogether and create one sort of unified permitted use category.
Thank you. I mean, we were pretty close last time. I don't know if it would be appropriate to move it, but the chair to consider given it's late.
What? I mean, it's, what would the commission like to do on this one? I mean, I think it's worth having the final fuller discussion rather than pushing, you know, rushing right now, but it's really up to the commission over what you want to do.
If you don't do anything with it tonight, it will be on your agenda on Tuesday.
Which is just a few days away, so.
One thing I will say is that I don't think city council has capacity to consider this as quickly as we would get it up to them, is my instinct right now, because of what you said earlier tonight about March or something.
Well, I mean, the election, we have the March election coming up. I mean, if, probably my guess is very little of what we're doing right now is going to be considered until after the new council steps in, which is in early April.
So we're not slowing anything down by debating, in other words, right?
I don't
One more.
think
A little
so.
bit was just my own
but
personal
it's-
bias,
Oh,
not,
so you wanted to be there.
not being able to make next meeting because I, you know, wanted to make the motion. But so be it. We'll see it again, right? After when it comes back, right?
It'll be on your agenda on Tuesday, but to your point, the next action is really for the referral to the council. You already held your public hearing, so unless the council made changes to it at their level, it shouldn't come back to you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
That's only if they make changes.
it's only if they make changes to it, yep.
As Megan said, we've warned it, we've asked for change, we've had the public hearing over a couple different time periods, we've made changes, so we're really on to the final consideration before it moves on to the city council. And then they go through their process, which they generally have at least 2 readings of it. They send it to their committee. I'm pretty sure there's going to be, like, you know, good debate there as well. So, you know, it's going to, they'll move at whatever speed they do it, but I don't think it's going to get that much consideration from them until a little bit later on. But who knows? I mean, they might want to push it through quicker.
Yeah, at this point, whether you took action tonight or next Tuesday, it's not going to go to the council until their first meeting in February for their first reading and referral to Ordinance Committee. I know Ben, who was here earlier, is the chair of the Ordinance Committee, and he's expressed that he's eager to take this up and work on it as an Ordinance Committee. So I think they're definitely ready for it to be referred to them. But at this point, it's not going to make it on Monday night's council agenda regardless of whether you do anything with it tonight or not. So.
Can I just ask, what are we, this is something that we've already discussed at a public hearing, and this is just another revision after the public hearing before it actually goes to the city council, is that correct? This is like a half boomerang?
That's right.
Sweet.
Yeah, really what we're doing is taking action on the public hearing. Yeah.
No further
No, it's just-
questions, Chair.
It's just finalizing our discussion and final actions on it.
Yeah, personally, I'm ready to vote to approve this, but I wasn't one of the people who had issues with it as it was written last time, so I'm curious.
I mean, I would just say, I think it would be healthy to have our final discussion on it. Because I know I've heard from various folks who have said that they want to just have some final discussion, some final input on it. But I think we have plenty of time at our next meeting. And as Megan said, it's not going to really slow down or change the process at all. I just think it's a better discussion when we're all fresher.
Then I will reserve my sense of deja vu and, exceed your point about doing things in a rational way is a good one.
Okay, good. Thank you. Then we'll close that item out. We have our next meeting on Tuesday. Do we have a executive committee meeting before that one? So, and that's at 5 o'clock? 5:30. So there'll be an executive committee meeting at 5:30 next Tuesday as well. And with that, I think we are on to adjournment, item 6. Do we have a motion to adjourn? Motion by Michael, seconded by Bruce, who were the only ones I could really see. I apologize for not being able to see the folks who were remote very well, but next time I think if I come to a hybrid like this, I'm going to bring my laptop so I could keep track of everybody. I think that might make it easier.
And next week we'll be back downstairs where we have the screen that's easier to see everything.
Well, do you think Alex knows his head is like 4.5 feet tall?
At least. All right. So we had a motion and second to adjourn. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye or raise your hand. Aye. We stand adjourned. Thank you, everybody.